Today we will discuss the poem The Second Coming by W.B. Yeats. The main objectives of this program are to explore and appreciate poetry as another medium of written and spoken expression, to interpret the meaning of the poem, to identify and examine the significance of specific themes of the poem, to revisit character, action, setting and feeling, and finally to unravel the complex symbolism that was used in the poem The Second Coming. The Second Coming is a poem written by William Butler Yeats in 1919 in the aftermath of the First World War, and was first published in the American magazine The Dial in November 1920. Later on, it was included in the volume entitled Michael Roberts and the Dancer in the year 1921. It was written at a time when Yeats was puzzled by violence displayed by events like the Easter Rebellion of 1916, the Irish Civil War that followed it, and the European Great World War of 1914 to 1918. And in terms of his philosophy of history, a new age in the world's history was going to begin. He believed that a full circle of the wheel, that is the moon, corresponds in time to approximately 2000 years. At the beginning of each one of such 2000-year period, a new dispensation is announced. This pattern could be seen in the history of the world from about the year 2000 BC. In that year, the egg of Leda is supposed to have been hatched out. In Greek mythology, Leda was the mother of Helen, Castor, Pollux and Clytemnestra. These were her children by her union with the great god Zeus, who appeared to her and made love to her not in his own form but in the assumed form of a swan. From the date that Zeus appeared to Leda, the first known age of the world began. This age was at its full maturity, that is full moon, by about the year 1000 BC, when Homer sang about it. At about the time that Jesus was born, another interference by God in human affairs, that Leda-Zeus age was over and the Christian age begun. In the 20th century, that Christian age in its turn was coming to an end. The poet believed that a new age was therefore due. One may not agree with the poet's system, but without taking note of it, some of his important poems will be unintelligible. One such poem is The Second Coming, written with the Irish troubles, the Great War and other troubles in mind, and displaying his philosophy of a vision which he was to formulate and organize in 1925. The speaker describes a nightmarish scene: the falcon, turning in a widening gyre, cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold, anarchy is loosed upon the world, the blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best people, the speaker says, lack all conviction, but the worst are full of passionate intensity. Surely, the speaker asserts the world is near a revelation. Surely, the second coming is at hand. No sooner does he think of the second coming than he is troubled by a vast image of the Spiritus Mundi, or the collective spirit of mankind. Somewhere in the desert, a giant sphinx, a shape with lion body and the head of a man, a gaze as blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving while the shadows of desert birds reel about it. The darkness drops again over the speaker's sight, but he knows that the Sphinx's 20 centuries of stony sleep have been made a nightmare by the motions of a rocking cradle. And what rough beast, he wonders, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. This powerful poem was born out of the poet's conviction that the Christian civilization was nearing the end of its allotted span of 2000 years, and a new phase antithetical to it in nature was about to begin. The conviction arose out of the deepening disintegration of Europe, of which the First World War and the political commotion in Ireland were the explosive symptoms. Thus, the poet's mind was filled with gloom in consequence of the widespread murder and bloodshed in Ireland in the course of the Easter Rebellion of 1916. The Irish Civil War that followed the Great War of 1914 to 1918 and various other events in Europe added to that gloom. The poem is the outcome of a state of mind troubled with ominous William Butler Yeats was born in Dublin in 1865. His father, a portrait painter, moved the family to London when Yeats was just 2 years old, and William spent much of his childhood moving between the cold urban landscape of the metropolis and the congenial countryside of County Sligo, Ireland, where his mother's parents lived. An aesthete, even as a boy, Yeats began writing verse early and published his first work in the year 1885. Yeats lived during a tumultuous time in Ireland, during the political rise and fall of Charles Stuart Parnell, the Irish Revival and the Civil War. He quickly rose to literary prominence and helped to found the Abbey Theatre, one of the most important cultural institutions in Ireland, at which he worked with such luminaries as Augusta Gregory and the playwright John Synge. In 1923, Yeats was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature and died in 1939 at the age of 73. Writing most of his greatest poems from the crushing power of the tower to the eerie mysticism of the last poems in the years after he won the Nobel Prize stands as a testament to the force and commitment with which he devoted himself to transforming his inner life into poetry. Indeed, he wrote great poems in every decade of his life, and his influence has towered over the past 6 decades. Today, he is generally regarded as the greatest poet of the 20th century. Yeats spent years crafting an elaborate mystical theory of the universe, which explained history, imagination, and mythology in light of an occult set of symbols, and which he laid out in his book, A Vision, which is usually considered important today only for the light it sheds on some of his poems. This theory issued in part from Yeats's lifelong fascination with the occult and mystical, and in part from the sense of responsibility Yeats felt to order his experience within a structured belief system. The system is extremely complicated and not of any lasting importance except for the effect that it had on his poetry, which is of extraordinary lasting importance. The theory of history Yeats articulated in A Vision centers on a diagram made of two conical spirals, one inside the other, so that the widest part of one of the spiral rings around the narrowest part of the other spiral, and vice versa. Yeats believed that this image, which he calls the spirals as gyres, captured the contrary motions inherent within the historical process, and he divided each gyre into specific regions that represented particular kinds of historical periods. He also represented the philosophical phases of an individual's development, these gyres. Yeats' own experience is never far from his poems, even when they seem obscurely imagistic or theoretically abstract, and the veil of obscurity and abstraction is often lifted once one gains an understanding of how the poet's lived experiences relate to the poem, which is now in discussion. Yeats' goal is always to arrive at personal truth, and in that sense, despite his profound individuality, he remains one of the most universal writers ever to have lived. Now let's see the meaning of the poem line by line, but before we go to the meaning, let's read the poem once. The Second Coming, written by William Butler Yeats. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the centre cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-timid tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming. Hardly are those words out when a vast image out of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight. A waste of desert sand, a shape with lion body and the head of a man. A gaze blank and pitiless as the sun is moving its slow thighs, while all about it wind shadows of the indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. And what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born? Now I'm coming to the meaning of the poem. So, as the poem is read out, we understand that the poem is around 22 lines, It opens as if the poet were seeing a vision. Yeats saw great social troubles all around him and remarks on a world spinning out of control. As if in a trance, the poet visualized a gyre or cone circling swiftly around a fixed center. Its circumference gets wider and wider, and ultimately, even the center fails to control its movements, which is given in the third line. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. And the second line says that the falconer has lost control over the falcon, which does not hear his call. Falcon symbolizes the intellect, and falconer the spiritual and emotional makeup of man. Intellect, that is science and technology and rationalism, is too much with us, and it is leading us to wholesale annihilation. As a result, sheer anarchy has been let loose upon the world, as given in the fourth line. There is violence and bloodshed on all sides. Line 2 hints at technology progressing beyond mankind's ability to control it. The problem was evident to Yeats 80 years ago, and as we all see, the problem has worsened since then. Yeats shows his concern that technology has advanced to the point where mankind can do a great deal of harm with relative ease. The world had never seen destructions of the likes of World War I, and most people were shocked at the extensive loss of human life during the war. Line 5. The blood-dimmed tide is suggestive of blind passion and visualizes the great biblical flood and the disaster which fostered purity and innocence, which is everywhere threatened with extinction, as given by the sixth line. And then the lines 7 and 8 say that the best, the wisest, the aristocratic have lost all faith and conviction, and the worst, the masses and fanatical, irrational beings, are full of violence. In the time that Yeats speaks of, the rulers of the world were caught up in imperialism and expanding circles of power to the point where they would do almost anything to accomplish their goals. The ruthless power mongers were outspoken and numerous, and there seemed to be few who dared to speak out against them in the name of peace. All this disastrous upsurge of anarchy connotes that a new civilization is about to arrive. Just as God incarnated himself in the person of Christ when the Greco-Roman civilization collapsed 2000 years ago, so also the second coming of God seems to be round the corner, given by the first two lines of the second stanza. Let me read the lines once again, the first two lines of second stanza. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. No sooner does the idea flash across the poet's mind than he sees the image of some bizarre form coming out of Spiritus Mundi, a kind of storehouse of images in Yeats's philosophy, given by the lines 4, 5 and 6 of the second stanza. Here are the lines. Hardly are those words out when a vast image out of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight, a waste of desert sand, a shape with lion body and the head of a man. This grotesque form has the body of a lion and the head of a human being. It is seen coming out of some distant desert and advancing slowly and with clumsy and ungainly movement given by the line, is moving its slow thighs towards Bethlehem, the birthplace of Christ. The last line of the poem slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. Yeats sees the Sphinx rising up to bring forth the end of the world. The Sphinx slept in a world of nightmares for 2000 years. The nightmares were caused by the turmoils of the human race. We find this in the last lines towards the end of the poem. The darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. The last few lines of the second stanza also tell us that the form is so frightful and terrible that the birds fly before it in utter alarm and fear. The monster has a cruel blank look, as if it were the symbol of the pitiless and relentless destiny. It represents a thoughtless and merciless violence, and its birth is the death of existing civilization. Thus, Yeats reveals no hope for the continued existence of mankind. Now let's see the structure and style of the poem. The poem consists of 22 lines, as you can see, in 2 verse paragraphs. The first is of 8 lines and the second is of 14 lines. This renders a rather imbalanced feeling of the poem, giving more importance and pouring more information into one than into the other. This fact acquires more relevance when we acknowledge that Yeats structures his poems in a definite stanza pattern. It is a masterpiece of artistic maturity, marked by the careful selection of precise details and images of exact words with their reverberation and a solemn rhythm to create the terrifying atmosphere of the apocalypse, appropriate to the vision of violent destruction and equally monstrous rebirth. The second coming is written in a blank verse pattern in a very rough iambic pentameter, but the meter is so loose and the exceptions so frequent that it actually seems closer to free verse with frequent heavy stresses. For instance, the third and fourth lines have a consonant rhyme. Only 14 of 22 lines consist of near 10 syllables, which means that up to 8 lines out of 22 are different, enough to disrupt the pattern. The lack of structure is reinforced by the existence of 8 enjambments, for example, 5th line, 7th line, 11th line, and 8 caesuras as in the 11th line. The rhymes are likewise haphazard. Apart from the 2 couplets with which the poem opens, there are only coincidental rhymes in the poem such as man and sun. Yeats also makes use of special sound devices such as the 3 stressed syllables in a row in line 21. What rough beast! The repetition of words, as in the first 2 lines of the second stanza at the beginning and the end of them, surely at hand. This causes a great confusion in the mind of the reader, as the poem is constantly ignoring the structure, which adds to the complexity and the shock that the metaphors generate in the reader's mind when it is read. Thus, Yeats' poem is much more confusing, not conforming to the structures and mixing patterns, increasing the sense of chaos and loss of control that the poem gives metaphorically. Now, towards the conclusion, let's try to critically appreciate the poem. Because of its stunning, violent imagery and terrifying ritualistic language, The Second Coming is one of Yeats's most famous and most anthologized poems. It is also one of the most thematically obscure and difficult to understand. Structurally, the poem is quite simple. The first stanza describes the conditions present in the world by words like things falling apart, anarchy, etc. And the second stanza surmises from those conditions that a monstrous second coming is about to take place, not of the Jesus we first knew, but of a new Messiah, a rough beast, the slouching Sphinx, rousing itself in the desert and lumbering toward Bethlehem. The Second Coming was intended by Yeats to describe the current historical moment. The poem, we need to remember the poem appeared in 1921. So, Yeats describes the current historical moment in terms of these gyres. Yeats believed that the world was on the threshold of an apocalyptic revelation as history reached the end of the outer gyre, to speak roughly, and began moving along the inner gyre. In his definitive edition of Yeats's poems, Richard J. Finneran quotes Yeats's own notes. The end of an age which always receives the revelation of the character of the next age is represented by the coming of one gyre to its place of greatest expansion and of the other to its place of greatest contraction. The revelation approaches will take its character from the contrary movement of the interior gyre. In other words, the world's trajectory along the gyre of science, democracy and heterogeneity is now coming apart, like the frantically widening flight path of the falcon that has lost contact with the falconer. The next age will take its character not from the gyre of science, democracy and speed, but from the contrary inner gyre, which presumably opposes mysticism, primal power and slowness to the science and democracy of the outer gyre. The rough beast slouching towards Bethlehem is the symbol of this new age. The speaker's vision of the rising Sphinx is his vision of the character of the new world. Towards the concluding part, The Second Coming is a magnificent statement about the contrary forces at work in history and about the conflict between the modern world and the ancient world. The aesthetic experience of its passionate language is powerful enough to ensure its value and its importance in Yeats's work as a whole.